Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Ask Zajef Kokomi Edition, Volume 2. So, we have Kokomi's rerun and Ganyu's rerun right around the corner, so I decided to redo Kokomi's Ask Zajef because she's pretty relevant in a lot of the Dendro teams. So, yeah. First things first, what is her overall place in the meta and how she compares to the other 5-star Hydros in terms of strengths and weaknesses, especially in the new Dendro teams? As a general rule, all the Hydro 5-stars are good. I would say that what Kokomi brings is quite valuable because she effectively just functions very well in many different archetypes, and she's just pretty strong overall. She's good in taser teams. She's good in freeze teams. She's not great in vape teams, so I generally would stay away from them, but if you have to use her there, she can kind of function still. She's got some overvape teams, right, the infamous Sukokomon, and she also has a few Dendro teams now. With Dendro, she can work pretty well in certain Hyperbloom teams that want to not apply too much Hydro, so they keep Quicken on the enemy, because Hydro applied multiple times will remove Quicken. So slow Hydro means that you don't do that, but also because it's slower, you don't get as many Hyperblooms. We also have had leaks on Nilou, and we know that she's meant to be played only with Hydro and Dendro units, right? Because one of her Ascension passives only works if your team is made of only Hydro and Dendro units, and considering we don't have a Dendro healer, and we haven't had any news of a future Dendro healer anytime soon, she's also probably going to be the best healer option for Nilou teams. She's very much a comfort unit, but unlike some other comfort units like Zhongli, where, yeah, he's very comfortable, and if you don't enjoy the combat system that much, you don't want to learn enemy attack patterns, he's a very valuable pull. But if you do want to learn the enemy's attack patterns, if that's the kind of stuff that you enjoy, Zhongli's like not nearly as valuable. But that's not really the case for Kokomi, because Kokomi is still quite valuable in a lot of the teams where you would put her, whether you need a healer or not. How much has changed since her release in 2.1? Not that much. I mean, we got the new Ocean Hued Clam set, which obviously helped her a lot. Apart from that though, there's a new Dendro teams, but I would argue that you generally have better Hydro options with the current ones. There's the Nilou stuff, but she's not out yet, and we're not even sure it's gonna synergize well yet. So it's really mostly just the Clam set, but you don't even use the Clam set on every team where you use Kokomi, so it doesn't really matter. Like, it does matter, it does help her damage when you use her on field, but it's far from necessary, and it's far from like the only thing that makes her a good unit. She would still be good if Clam set didn't exist, albeit not quite as good in some specific teams. When is she a bad pull over the other 5-star units? Okay, she's never really a bad pull over the other 5-star units. She's definitely not a great pull if you already have some of the other 5-star Hydros, because in a lot of the teams they are interchangeable, but she's still like pretty much always at least an acceptable one. Weapon and artifact sets / stats overview in her various teams, i.e. is Moonglow viable in Dendro teams now? Okay, this is... it's very complicated, but Moonglow is like, it's an okay weapon for on-field Kokomi. It always has been. It's just definitely never worth rolling for. And in some teams, it's going to be slightly ahead of the other Catalyst options, but not by much. And it's just never something I would recommend overall. Now, obviously, people don't always go for weapons because it's a good weapon. Sometimes people go for weapon because it's the signature and they want to get the unit with the signature, which fine. But yeah, so generally, her weapon options are basically TTDS and Hakushin Ring. Hakushin if you're running her like in Taser with other Electro units. Prototype Ember also works. That's kind of it. And then you'd either run her on 4-piece Clam or on 4-piece Tenacity of the Millilith. If you play her in certain Bloom teams, either with Nilou or potentially with like fridge stuff where she's the trigger for Bloom and not for Hyperbloom or Burgeon, you can run her on the 4-piece Gilded Dream set with Sac Frag, but as a general rule, I wouldn't do that. Also, if you run her in Dendro teams in general, you will generally want to be going for the Deepwood, whatever, the Dendro artifact set that shreds Dendro resistance, because Kokomi is a pretty small portion of your team's DPS. Attack percent from TOM wouldn't actually do that much on most Dendro teams, especially Hyperbloom Dendro teams, where you would actually play Kokomi. but the Dendro Red Shred set, no matter who you put it on, is very good, and being able to put other sets on your other units can be valuable. But yeah, so it's basically generally gonna be, in Dendro teams, sometimes the Deepwood set, otherwise either TOM or Clam. If you're on-fielding her, Clam is very good. If you're not on-fielding her, TOM is generally better. There can be situations where like really high investment, Clam does a little bit more damage than TOM, but I still don't like it as much. Or, it's not that it does more damage, it gives more damage to your team than TOM, but I still generally wouldn't recommend it in teams where you don't on-field your Kokomi. How much ER does Kokomi need in her teams? It heavily depends. The more time she spends on-field, the less she needs ER. If you on-field her and you're fighting enemies that drop a lot of particles, you can go as low as like between 130 and 140. But if you don't on-field her and you use her just like for her hydro application off-field, you can actually need upwards of like 230, 240 energy recharge. Are any of her constellations worth? No. This one's pretty easy. 5-star constellations are never worth. But I'm assuming you just mean like how good her constellations are, which we can talk about. I kind of haven't looked into them that much. Her C1 is pretty good because it's a separate instance of hydro application, so it helps for hydro app, and it's an okay amount of damage as well. Her C2 just makes her heal more, which you don't need. Her C3, is that the burst or the skill? The burst one is okay. If you play her on field, a significant portion of her damage comes from Clam. And if you play her off field, she doesn't really do much damage. Then talent level constellations aren't actually as valuable as they usually are. Now, you still get a good amount of your damage from your talents, but it's not like 100% of it, which obviously drives down the value of something like talent level constellations. Her C4, her C4 is effectively fixes her energy needs when you on-field her, because you basically end up generating like about 15 energy, but it's not like you need to fix it anyways. The way that Kokomi's damage works is because she only scales with really one stat, right? Yeah, she scales with healing bonus, but you can't get that as a substat. She scales with hydro damage, but you can't get that as a substat. When it comes to your substats, she only scales with HP. Technically also with attack, but it's such a small fraction that it's not that much. But the point being, on Kokomi, it's actually not that difficult to get a decent amount of HP while still getting a lot of ER. And so fixing her energy needs isn't something that you need to do, because really the only stats you're looking for in your substats are HP percent and ER. And I guess flat HP. So there's no need for an energy restoration constellation, because sure, she has energy requirements, but at least when she's on field, they're easy to meet. C5 doesn't do shit, and then C6 is what, hydro damage? Yeah, 40% hydro damage. It's fine. It's also not all that great. I'd say her best constellation is probably her C1. But yeah, so when it comes to constellations, I'd say none of her constellations are really worth, right, to answer the actual question. Her best constellation is probably C1, but it's definitely not worth. At least when it comes to money. Obviously, if you like her, you want to go for her, and you want to go for her constellation just because it's a character you like, I'm not gonna stop you. But when it comes to how good they are, they're not very good. How does Clam Kokomi Taser compare to the other variations of Taser? It's actually very good. It's up there with the other best ones. You don't get to use on-field sucrose if you're using Kokomi, which means that you don't have an on-field grouper like you do in the traditional sucrose Taser team. And because Kokomi's hydro obligation goes it just becomes completely terrible if the enemies walk out of her E range, then you have to make sure that you're positioning properly in this team. Whereas with sucrose Taser, it's a lot more unga bunga. But with sucrose Taser, you don't have a healer, whereas in this team you do. And when it comes to actual output, they're not very far away from each other. So Clam Kokomi is definitely a solid variation of Taser teams. Personally, I don't like it very much because I find the grouping from Sucrose to be just so good, but it's still very solid. Does she have any Burgeon teams, or did they turn out quite cool? Yes. I'm answering yes to this A or B question. She does have Burgeon teams, but so far I haven't managed to make any good ones. I've looked into Kokomi, Fischl, Dendro, Toma. Haven't liked it nearly as much as a bunch of the other Burgeon teams I've tried. And I've looked into Kokomi, Dendro, Toma, and then either a second Dendro or a Hydro. Second Dendro I didn't like very much because it felt like you just triggered too much burning. And second Hydro, it was okay, but it didn't feel like the Burgeon damage I was getting was better than just playing a different team with Kokomi on field. It has some potential, I just don't feel like any of our Dendro units are kind of good enough to enable good Burgeon teams, unfortunately. That's not true. I think there are some Burgeon teams that can work, but with Kokomi, I don't think we have anything that works well enough. Is Kokomi Fridge even competitive with the existing freeze comps? Not at all. Oh, not at all. It's very bad. I love it. it. I think the idea is really, really cool. And situationally, when you're against like ventiable enemies, it is actually pretty solid. But it's so restricted to that, and it's so bad outside of that, that it's a fun team, and that's it. You don't play Fridge because you're trying to get your 36th star, you know? You play Fridge because you think it's funny as fuck, and because it's called Fridge. Is main DPS Kokomi viable, or is it more of a meme? It depends on what you mean by main DPS. The word main DPS is so fucking terrible for people's perceptions of units. Because of the way the Genshin combat system works, you'll have multiple team archetypes that don't really have a quote-unquote main DPS. You look at taser teams, right? Who the fuck is the main DPS here? Suko is the one that's spending the most field time, but that's not what main DPS means. DPS is damage per second. If you're not the main damage per second, then that's not main DPS. Anyways, I really don't like the term main DPS. I prefer talking about like field time and role. So in this team, right, I refer to Sucrose as an on-field driver and grouper, to Fischl as an off-field damage dealer and battery, Beto as off-field damage dealer, and Xingqiu as off-field damage dealer. When you look at Kokomi teams, she doesn't have teams where she would be like hyper carry like you could have with someone like Hu Tao. But she does have teams where her role is on-field damage dealer. Is she doing the most damage on your team? In a good team? Generally not. Or if she is, it's not by much. And it's because you have multiple other units in your team that are sharing the damage, right? So it's weird, right? Because I don't think I'd call that main DPS, because they're not the main form of DPS from the team. But I think that's what you want to ask, right? Is on-field damage dealer Kokomi viable? And the answer to that is definitely yes. Taser teams are a very good example of an on-field damage dealer Kokomi. Like, sure, the reason why you play her in that team over someone like Yoimiya is because she's Hydro, so her elemental application is there, and she does have a certain amount of enabling. But the reason why you play her and not Barbara is because she does damage. She actually does a decent amount of damage. And the other possibility is that you're asking about hyper carry Kokomi, which is like just a lot of like 3 off-field units that are really focused on buffing damage, and then on-field carry Kokomi. And to that question, I would say no. It's more of a meme for sure. Can Kokomi fill the flex slot in aggravate teams, or would the bloom triggers be detrimental? She can. So I've talked about this in my reaction guide, which you can check out right in the description below, the part 3 that is focused on Dendro. But if you apply Hydro to Quicken, okay, wait. Right, you get a bloom, but you still have the Quicken for a little while. It ends up expiring not long after, right? Which is very relevant, right? You don't keep it for very long, but you do have it for a little while. Which means that if you have both off-field Dendro and Electro, right, you can get blooms without actually losing your Quicken. Right? We still get all the aggravate procs and shit, right? We're still vibing. But if I were to do it with Child instead, this time also pay attention to the aura at the top of the screen. Right? And it's gonna be Hydro for most of the time. We have very, very little Quicken up time. The way that Quicken works is it's an aura, which means you can react with it. And if you react with it with Hydro, it reduces the duration. And if you react with it with Hydro twice, assuming 1-1-1 for the gauges, but whatever, you're gonna remove it. So, in aggravate teams, where you don't want to lose your aggravate, you can run a Hydro unit, as long as that Hydro unit's Hydro application is slow enough that it won't overtake the Quicken. However, there's not that much of a reason to do that in most aggravate teams. Because in most aggravate teams, you would rather get another unit that deals damage than getting Kokomi. Because with slow Hydro, obviously, that means slow blooms, and that means not that many seeds to Hyper Bloom. In order for it to be worth to run Kokomi in an aggravate teams, you need a bunch of different conditions. A, you need to have a reason to keep Quicken, because if you don't have a reason to keep Quicken, you're better off with faster Hydro. But then on top of that, the way that Quicken is balanced with aggravate and spread is that if you only have one unit that benefits from Quicken, it's not that good of a reaction. It starts being very good when you have 2 or 3 units that benefit from it. So ideally, this is the bare minimum, but ideally 2 units that benefit from Quicken. What else do you need? Well, you need to have a unit that can trigger Hyper Bloom. But if that unit is built for Quicken stuff, they're not doing that much Hyper Bloom damage. And if they're built for Hyper Bloom, they don't benefit from Quicken. So ideally, different from those 2 units. And then finally, well, you need to have Kokomi on your damn team. So, the unit that can trigger Hyper Bloom cannot be a Dendro unit. It has to be an Electro or an Animal. But what about the units that benefit from Quicken? Well, you can have one Dendro, but if they don't do a lot of damage, they don't actually benefit from Quicken. So they're not a unit that can trigger Hyper Bloom, and they're not a unit that benefits that much from Quicken, which means, we would need a 5th slot to make this work properly. It's something that can work. It's just generally, if you only have one unit that benefits from Quicken, you'd be better off just generating more seeds and focusing on your Hyper Bloom stuff. That being said though, she can always be a decent flex slot. Even if she's not necessarily the best flex slot, she can always be a pretty good one still. But the reason why she's an okay flex slot isn't because the Hydro application she provides gives you enough Hyper Blooms that she becomes a good unit there. The reason why she's a good flex slot here is pretty simply because this team doesn't have a healer and Kokomi's a healer. And out of the defensive options that you have, you don't have a great one. And so at that point, then even though her Hydro application isn't optimal for damage dealing, she's still the healer. And that's still relevant. Can I explain why I said I didn't like Sukokomon during a previous stream? Sure. The biggest issue I have with Sukokomon is that when I play it, I very often end up in situations where I don't want to swap to Kokomi and like stay on her. Because if I do, then I start overloading the enemies away and it just doesn't feel good. They go away from the jellyfish and then I'm just like, oh, well that sucks. And so I just want to spend as much time as possible on Sucrose. But then if you're going to do that and you can get away without a healer, I'd rather just play the team with Xingqiu instead of Kokomi. How good is Kokomi with Shenhe? That's a weird question. I'm assuming you mean how good is Kokomi in freeze teams that use Shenhe? She's pretty good. It doesn't seem like we have any questions about Kokomi versus Mona specifically, so I'll talk about it a little bit, because it relates to freeze teams, right? I don't like Mona. I think that her kit is incredibly clunky. I think that every time I try to use her, something goes wrong. I think that I never get the actual amount of particles that you're supposed to get from her E, because it's, what is it, 3 to 4, I think? Yeah, it's 3 to 4. I never get 4. I've never gotten 4 in my fucking life. It's supposed to be a 33% chance to get 4. That's never happened to me. Half the time the enemies just aren't fucking on the E anymore when it explodes. Dude, honestly, I have my fair share of issues with Mona. But she's still a very solid options for freeze. I think that freeze kind of just doesn't have insane hydro options that have like good synergy with them. I really like Xingqiu as like my favorite option in freeze teams, but his Hydro App and AoE is a lot worse than a lot of the other AoE Hydro App units, which means that a lot of the time he's not actually going to be better. Point being, right, Xingqiu's a good option in freeze. I understand why people don't really like him that much. And so generally in freeze teams, people play either Mona or Kokomi. And Kokomi has the comfort of not needing tight rotations, having really good, like, a long-term Hydro application, and actually keeping the enemies frozen properly. With Mona, sometimes you just don't get your freeze to last as long as usual, but she can technically sheet better sometimes, like in some situations, but the quality of life that Kokomi provides, in my opinion, makes her overall better in freeze teams. And also she's a healer, so most people would rather run a healer than not run a healer. So if you were to run Mona, a lot of people would also like pair that with Diona, which is not very good. Like, you'd much rather go Kokomi Rosaria or Kokomi Shenhe than Mona Diona. That being said, she's far from necessary in freeze teams. Like, she's popular and for good reason. She is very comfortable in freeze teams, but she's far from the only option you can go for. And I don't want you to be like, okay, well, I'm using Ayaka, I'm using my Mona, I can 36 star, I'm vibing, but I heard that Kokomi's better, and I want to have a good team, so I guess I need to go for Kokomi. No, you don't. Mona is completely fine. Most of the differences between Kokomi and Mona in freeze teams are quality of life differences. And even then, once you get used to Mona, it's not nearly as bad. So make sure that you're not pulling for Kokomi just because you feel like you have to if you want to play one of the teams where Kokomi is good, because you really don't, right? Sukokomon works very well with Xingqiu. Freeze teams work very well with any number of the other Hydro units. Taser teams work very well with any number of other Hydro units as well. But I also don't want you to come away from this video thinking Kokomi is just completely useless and I should make fun of anyone who rolls for her, because that's not the case either. She's definitely a very strong unit still. The takeaway I want people to have from my videos is always the same. It's always, oh, okay, if I like this unit, I should go for them. And if I don't like this unit, I shouldn't. But if I don't have the spare Primo gems, then I guess I'll get them on their rerun or something. Considering how she's mostly highly regarded for her steady AoE off-field hydro application, how future-proof do I think Kokomi is? I've talked about this before, but I think the concept of future-proof is just a little bit weird, because Genshin's made it pretty clear that they're not doing power creep. They'll release really strong units every once in a while, but they're not stronger than the 1.0 units we've had. And when they release new units, they want the units to feel different from each other enough that they sell. So I don't actually expect other units to be released that fulfill the same kind of niche that Kokomi has. We might get better off-field AoE hydro application with damage. I don't think we're gonna get the same thing with a healer in the foreseeable future. Given what we know of Nilou currently, how will her release affect Kokomi, and would she be mandatory in Nilou team? So I've already talked about that, how she's probably gonna be the only like good healer option you have. You can also run Barbara, but I'll make a pre-release video on Nilou probably. We'll be able to talk about that. But as a general rule, I'm not too excited for Nilou so far. How many socks is Kokomi in terms of height? So Ziox is about 1'4". How tall is Kokomi? 5'3". Wait, I don't remember how you do math with feet. So it's almost 4 times. Almost 4 times taller than Ziox. But that does it for the Ask Zajef about Kokomi. I'm also very disappointed that nobody asked to do a voice line, but it is what it is. As usual, thank you for watching. Don't spend money you can't afford, and I hope you enjoy the 3.0 patch. Bye, YouTube. What if I do a voice line right now, and the editor adds it to the outro? Allow me! Covenant of the Deep!